What was the lowest of the low?
Waking up with no drugs or money or electricity in a, $10 million house.
In my eyes, as a kid who grew up, as a lower middle class family, I aspired for all these things, and I thought that if you didn't have them, you were not as cool as the kids in school who had everything. But at least when we finally realized that about ourselves and we're honest about it, and you can move forward. There was an article about me. I'll just say this: there was an article about me that said Scott Storch blew $30 million in cocaine. No, I did not. That I would be dead. Okay, I blew $30 million from the decisions that I made while I was under the influence of being high every day. In the first 10 years of success in my career, my management at the time had me in the studio. I even had all the fancy cars. They would sit in the parking lot of the studio, and that's all. They would never make it to the club. And I was kind of a nerd at that point because I had been so put into a bubble in the studio. Mm-hmm. Like my friends would come to the studio beforehand, and we would smoke out, and then they would go to the studio or go to the club, and I'd sit and work, and they'd come back and tell me how it was and this and that. But I was like really scared of all that shit. I was like, amazed by it. I would just want to listen to the stories. But then at one point, this girl, Paris Hilton, came in. I was working with her, and we got involved, and those cameras on you, and the nightlife, and everything just was like, holy shit. And it was like,
drawn in.
It was actually the beginning of the end.
Wow.
Scott Spencer Storch was born in Long Island, New York in December of 1973. Scott grew up as a middle-class Jewish kid. Aside from being raised in New York, he also spent time in Florida and Pennsylvania. Scott's mother once was a singer, while his father was a court reporter. Andrew Sonic, a childhood friend of Scott's, said that he was on the path to following his father's footsteps. This would not be the case due to Scott dropping out of school at the age of 15. Obviously, his parents were not thrilled about this, and Scott would end up crashing on the floor of a Philadelphia garage studio where Andrew Sonic was recording. It would be at this garage where the famous Philadelphia-based band The Roots would be recording their debut album. The members of The Roots at the time were impressed by Scott's skills on the keyboard. As a kid, he largely self-taught himself how to play the piano. In fact, his piano teacher told him that he was unteachable once. This was due to Scott not being very interested in music theory. He has always had his own way of playing the piano and has said that he plays the piano like a drum. Another thing to add is that Scott's parents did not always have the means for him to constantly get piano lessons growing up, but the Roots were impressed, and the sentiment about Scott was that he had a black soul in a white man's body. Richard Nichols is another important name in the backstory of Scott Storch. When Scott was still in school, he would skip and take the train from the suburbs of Philly to the city where he would meet Richard. Richard would go on to become the manager of The Roots, so this is how the connection started. This man would take Scott under his wing, and Scott would do odd jobs and did whatever he could do to support himself at 15 years old. This connection with Richard would eventually lead to a record deal with The Roots. Their debut album Organics would be released in May of 1993. Scott Storch would be involved with this album, with him being credited for playing the keyboard. This album was released before they got their major record deal with Geffen Records. This is who their sophomore album Do You Want More was released under. This album came out in 1995, and Scott would once again be credited for playing the keyboard on this album. He has production credits on a couple of different songs from Do You Want More, but the song Proceed is probably the most notable. The Do You Want More album would be the last project that Scott would do as a full-time member of The Roots. After this, he still worked with them on other albums, but by this time, he felt like a change was needed. Something snapped for him and he had a desire to be a producer. It was one too many times that I heard this term, "Oh, that's the white boy from the Roots." I didn't have an identity and I was just looked at as some guy who played keys, and I was actually the guy writing a lot of music involved. Then I just grew into my passion for writing and producing, and I found myself wanting to stay in the studio and not be on the road. Though Scott loved creating the type of music the Roots were doing, he wanted to venture over to the commercial side of the music industry. His decision to leave the group led to criticism from the Roots, who questioned this move. It would be further questioned when Scott Storch started working with Dr. Dre. Members of the group told Scott that he was working with Dr. Dre 10 years too late. Notably, this was before Dr. Dre's Monster 2001 album that dropped in 1999, and most likely after what Dr. Dre refers to as a hit and miss with Dr. Dre Presents The Aftermath in 1996. Speaking of Dr. Dre, Scott Storch would meet him through Eve, who is a famous Philadelphia rapper. Before Rough Riders, Eve was signed to Dr. Dre's Aftermath record label. While in Los Angeles, California, Eve and Scott Storch ran into each other, with the two being familiar with each other through the Philly music scene. Eve thought that Scott Storch was always cool to her, and she wanted to take him to meet Dr. Dre. The problem was that Scott Storch did not have any music with him, so he didn't know what he was going to play for Dr. Dre. Upon meeting him, Dr. Dre said that he heard that Scott Storch could play the keys really well. This would lead to Scott demonstrating his skills for Dr. Dre. At first, Scott thought that Dr. Dre was not interested in him due to him walking out of the room, but he returned to give Scott money and handed him a hotel room key to stay in LA because Scott initially had plans to go back to Philly before this. This led to Scott Storch staying out in LA, and he would start working on music with Dr. Dre with the song Big Egos, which appeared on 2001, being a song that they worked on the very next day. Now we're at the beginning of 1999, and the Roots would release the single You Got Me for their album Things Fall Apart.
What club I went to with my homies, baby, don't worry, you know that you got me.
This is one of the most popular songs by the Roots, with You Got Me peaking at number 39 on the Billboard Hot 100. By this time, Scott had left the group and had his own studio upstairs from where the Roots recorded. Scott happened to be working with the then unknown Philadelphia artist named Jill Scott. She was working at Urban Outfitters at the time and wanted to work with Scott so she could get a record deal. Questlove, a member of the Roots, heard the record and wanted it to be on Things Fall Apart. Scott gave him the record thinking that Jill would still be on it, but this was not the case. Though Jill Scott co-wrote the song, she would not be allowed to be on the single. This was due to MCA Records, the Roots record label at the time, wanting Erykah Badu to be on the record instead because she was a bigger name. Questlove has said that there was an underlying threat of MCA not pushing the record if Erykah Badu was not on it. Unfortunately, Quest had to tell Jill Scott the news, and he would say that he was a slave to his label and did not really have that much control over the situation. This is why Erykah is on the single, but there is a version with Jill Scott that some prefer. Also, a then unknown Eve raps on the second verse, but she does not really get credit either. You Got Me ended up winning Best Rap Performance by a Duo or Group at the 42nd Annual Grammy Awards. Obviously, this record was big for Scott's career, but later on that year, Scott would work on another record that did wonders as well. This would be Still DRE, which was released as a single in September of 1999.
Representing for the gangsters all across the world. Still hitting them corners and them lolos, girl.
This record came about through Dr. Dre and Scott just throwing ideas at a wall while in the studio. Dr. Dre had a drum pattern that he programmed to let play on his MPC. He just let it loop and he would let people jam out to it. Dr. Dre would take a break from working and started eating in the kitchen area of the studio. He was still in earshot of everything going on and would hear Scott Storch start playing the iconic piano melody of the song. And he opened the door, he's like, that's it right there. That's it. His ears are so dope. Dre was like, this is it. this is a single, and he was so excited that he ran back in and we effing recorded it and we started layering it together and just boom. By now, I'm assuming that a lot of people already know that the song would be sent to Jay-Z, where he would write what went on to become history. It's crazy that such a legendary artist from the East Coast wrote a West Coast classic. Insane. In 2000, X by Exhibit is the only notable record that Scott had production credits on. The song peaked at number 76 on the Billboard Hot 100. Moving to 2001, Scott has 4 songs of note. The first one is Lay Low by Snoop Dogg. The beat to that song is crazy. The second song is Breaking Neck by Busta Rhymes. Scott also co-produced this and it's one of my favorite songs from Busta Rhymes. The song peaked at number 26 on the Billboard Hot 100 chart. The third is Family Affair by Mary J. Blige, which topped the Billboard Hot 100. And the fourth song is Let Me Blow Your Mind by Eve featuring Gwen Stefani. Scott co-produced this song as well, and it ended up peaking at number 2 on the Billboard Hot 100.
I had to give you more. It's only been a year.
The hits did not stop coming because in 2002, Scott co-produced the Justin Timberlake song Cry Me a River. Scott got involved with the track through Timbaland, giving him a call. Timbaland would also co-produce the record as well. At the time, Justin was working on his debut album, with him recently going solo from NSYNC earlier that year. The song was huge, with it peaking at number 2 on the Billboard Hot 100. I never knew that Scott and Timbaland would end up having issues over this song. The issue was with the credits of the song. Scott alleged that Timbaland had been taking credit for Nate Danger Hill's work, which was his protege. Scott also claimed that even though he came up with the melody and bridge of Cry Me a River, which went on to win a Grammy, he was credited for just playing the keys. The problem between the two became public knowledge years later, which led to a hilarious diss track from Scott himself. Never knew that he rapped on the track before, and it's too funny not to show in this video. He decided to diss Timbaland, and it led to the hilarious diss track Built Like That.
I know the feeling, I'm with you. Won't you tell them how I made that shit cry me a river? But you trying to lose weight, trying to gain some respect. Still ain't lose that pack of Franks out the back of your neck. What's funny?
While this is hilarious, we know that the two have since patched things up, with Scott participating on Timbaland's Versus platform years later. But dialing it back to 2002, Scott would produce the Dub C song The Streets featuring Nate Dogg and Snoop Dogg. That beat is insane and everybody on that song slid. The Streets ended up peaking at number 81 on the Billboard Hot 100. This year, Scott produced 2 other big songs. Those were Family Portrait by Pink, which peaked at number 20 on the Billboard Hot 100. The other one was Fighter by Christina Aguilera, also peaking at number 20 on the Billboard Hot 100. Scott was raking in the hits, but the best for him was yet to come. 2003 to me is when Scott really began to heat up with the hits, as you'll see. Starting out the year, Scott produced Can't Hold Us Down by Christina Aguilera. This song peaked at number 12 on the Billboard Hot 100. Though this was a big record, it had nothing on Beyonce's song Baby Boy that released this year.
Baby boy, you stay on my mind, fulfill my fantasy.
Come on, girl, tell me how you feel.
This song topped the Billboard Hot 100 for 9 straight weeks. This would be for Beyonce's debut solo album, which was a big deal because this was outside of her group Destiny's Child. Scott Storch would help produce this album and the two clicked instantly. Beyonce liked his beats due to them being different and not sounding like other songs at the time. Baby Boy was not the only song that he did for her, because Scott also produced Naughty Girl and Me, Myself and I for Beyonce's debut solo album Dangerously in Love. Naughty Girl peaked at number 3 on the Billboard Hot 100, while Me, Myself and I peaked at number 4 on the Billboard Hot 100. Beyonce and Scott had great chemistry, and it was very evident by the chart success of their songs. On the rap side of things in 2003, Ja Rule and 50 Cent were feuding heavy, a feud that lasts to this day. Scott would produce tracks for both of them this year. He made it evident that he wasn't choosing sides and simply was just a producer trying to make money. Scott produced Ja Rule's song Clap Back, which peaked at number 44 on the Billboard Hot 100. Later on that year, 50 Cent's G-Unit released Poppin' Them Things as a single. Scott co-produced this with Dr. Dre. It did not chart on the Billboard Hot 100, but the track is still very notable due to its captivating beat and popularity still. In 2004, Scott Storch would top the charts once again due to producing the Terror Squad song Lean Back. This would top the Billboard Hot 100 for 3 weeks.
Do the rock away. Now lean back, lean back, lean back.
Scott went absolutely stupid with this beat. One of my favorite beats that he's ever produced. Fat Joe came over to his house, and within 15 minutes, Scott made the beat for Lean Back from scratch. Fat Joe did not lay the vocals on the beat that day and sat on the song for months. While on the Howard Stern show back in 2004, he talked about how he knew the song was a hit, but he was scared of the beat. He did not want to mess up the song, and he definitely didn't because the song was a smash hit and it still gets played to this day. Fat Joe saying Scott Storch's name on Lean Back changed everything for him because it now put his name on this smash hit of a song. What it did for Scott Storch's career cannot be understated. Scott also produced Mario's song Let Me Love You this year as well. Let Me Love You would top the Billboard Hot 100 for 9 consecutive weeks.
You should let me love you, let me be the one to.
Neo would write this song before he became a big star. When Mario first heard Let Me Love You, he didn't think that it would become as big as it did. The original song got lost due to the engineer accidentally erasing the whole song by mistake. This then led to Mario having to redo it, but it ended up being better in his opinion. The last song that Scott produced in 2004 that I wanted to mention is You Make Me Wanna by Jadakiss featuring Mariah Carey. This song peaked at number 21 on the Billboard Hot 100. 2005 would come around, and this was a huge year for him musically and in his personal life. At the top of the year, 50 Cent released Candy Shop, which got produced. Candy Shop would manage to top the Billboard Hot 100 chart.
Take you to the candy shop. I let you the lollipop. Go ahead, girl.
Though this is one of 50 Cent's biggest hits, it was originally intended for Fat Joe. According to Scott Storch, Fat Joe did not take the beat because he felt like it was quote unquote too poppy. Now, Fat Joe in the past has said that he made this beat, but I won't necessarily say that he made it. Yes, he did tell Scott Storch what he wanted for the beat, but as far as physically making the beat, that was all Scott. The same thing goes for Lean Back as well. Scott gave plenty of opportunities for Joe to take the beat and called him numerous times. Ultimately, the Candy Shop beat was given to 50 Cent and it became a smash hit. It's really funny because Fat Joe and 50 had problems at the time, so the beat going to 50 is kind of hilarious. Because of the beef, Scott Storch just told Fat Joe that he had a client who he didn't name, which was 50 Cent, who was interested in the beat. Maybe if Scott Storch told the name of the client to Fat Joe, things might have been a little different. Things weren't all bad for Joe because later on in the year, Scott produced a song for him called Get It Poppin' featuring Nelly. Get It Poppin' peaked at number 9 on the Billboard Hot 100. I kid you not, doing research for this video was the first time that I've ever heard this song, never heard it before in my life. I do think it's safe to say that Get It Poppin' is no Candy Shop by any means, despite its chart success. But Candy Shop was not the only song that Scott produced for 50 Cent this year because he would also produce Just a Little Bit. This song peaked at number 3 on the Billboard Hot 100. In the summer, Lil Kim released her single Lighters Up, which Scott produced. This song peaked at number 31 on the Billboard Hot 100. Outside of this being another hit that Scott produced, I wanted to mention it because Lil Kim and Scott used to date back in the day. Lil Kim is one of the many high-profile women that Scott was linked to. The two have even gone as far as to say that they would have married each other, but things simply did not work out. They remain cool to this day though. By 2005, Lil Kim was already a star, but someone who had yet to become one was Chris Brown. Scott Storch met Chris Brown just when he was about to turn 16. Before making what went on to become Run It, Scott told a young Chris Brown that he was going to make him a #1 song so he could become a superstar. Scott definitely delivered on this promise because Run It topped the Billboard Hot 100 for 5 weeks, sparking Chris Brown's legendary music career. This wasn't the only song that Scott produced for Chris Brown's debut album in 2005. He also produced the song Gimme That, which peaked at number 15 on the Billboard Hot 100. In my opinion, this is one of the best songs that Scott has ever produced. Top 3 for sure, and that remix with Lil Wayne is absolutely bananas. Earlier, I mentioned that 2005 would be a big shift in Scott's personal life, and this would be due to Scott moving to Miami. By 2005, Scott had worked with Dr. Dre for years, but knew that Dr. Dre was not going to hand him over his empire. Because of this, Scott decided to do his own thing and move back to Florida to work on pop music and start his own label. This wouldn't necessarily be why Dr. Dre and Scott Storch fell out, because Scott blames their fallout on his drug use. He admits that he burnt a lot of bridges due to his drug use, but more on this later. Now it's 2006 and Scott managed to have a couple of hits this year along with a couple of really good records. Lord Give Me a Sign by DMX and Why We Thugs by Ice Cube are 2 very notable songs that Scott produced this year. As far as hits, Scott Storch produced Make It Rain for Fat Joe. This song peaked at number 13 on the Billboard Hot 100. Another song would be About Us by Brooke Hogan, which is Hulk Hogan's daughter. About Us featured Paul Wall and peaked at number 33 on the Billboard Hot 100. Scott produced a majority of her debut album, Undiscovered. Brooke Hogan was also signed to his record label. Another album that Scott largely produced was Paris Hilton's debut album. This is another high-profile woman that Scott dated at a point in time. But Scott Storch opting to work with Paris Hilton cost him a chance to produce Christina Aguilera's 2006 album Back to Basics, which would top the Billboard 200 charts and has gone double platinum. Christina would diss Scott Storch over this, with her having an interlude on Back to Basics titled FUSS, which stands for FU Scott Storch. Scott was not pleased by this and said that the album was full of filler, had over-singing, and was just lame Vegas-like cabaret music. This was said back in the day though. In the past, Scott has talked about how meeting and being with Paris Hilton changed his life. Before meeting her, Scott said that he was constantly working in the studio and didn't really go out much. He had all these things like cars, but he rarely drove them because he was constantly making music. Paris Hilton would change all of this because she's the great-granddaughter of Conrad Hilton, the founder of the Hilton hotel chain. She comes from a billion-dollar family. Now that Scott was dealing with her, he had to deal with the paparazzi, and she turned him onto the nightlife. It's very obvious what this nightlife included. People within the music industry knew who Scott was, but now through being attached to Paris Hilton, the world would finally put a face behind the name Scott Storch, which they've heard in numerous songs. His stock drastically went up, but not for long, because rather than focusing on working, he was now partying. This is very evident because after 2006, the days of Scott Storch dropping hit after hit after hit were over. In fact, he did not produce a single song that charted within the top 40 of the Billboard Hot 100 until 2019 with Chris Brown's song Undecided. Don't get it twisted, because in 2007, Scott still produced for a lot of people. Trey Songz, Jill Scott, Daddy Yankee, Chris Brown, Kelly Rowland, etc. But them days of hits were long over. Speaking of 2010, I had no clue that Scott co-produced Big Boy's song Shutterbug. I absolutely love this song. All my 2K11 players know what's up. One of the best songs on that classic soundtrack. But dialing it back to 2007, and this is when the troubles outside of music really began for Scott. It's reported that from August of 2006 to January of 2006, Scott spent $30 million. Scott says that the number was way higher than that. He was buying exotic cars, boats, drugs, jewelry, etc. At one point, he was once worth upwards of $70 million, but he blew through it all. He had a 24-hour blunt roller on staff and had expenses that exceeded over $1 million a month. Derek Jackson, Scott's manager during this time period, would say, "A lot of the work that we would do and how much we would do of it, that started to scale back. I have to say the magic month was August of 2006. I will never forget it. It will be something that will stay with me for the rest of my life. You know, 06 for us was the magic year. We hit the lotto. I mean, there was nothing that we did that did not work. I gotta honestly say, outside of my kids, it was the greatest year of my life. It was so many hit records. I can't even tell you. That was the year he won ASCAP's Songwriter of the Year award. We broke records. Lots of chart records we broke, and he did them quick. It was just a wonderful year, but I think it was defined by that magic month of August. He ran into the Hollywood class, and when he went to Hollywood, all things changed. Derek would also say that he takes partial blame because he was an enabler. Due to Scott's addiction, people would have to wait hours in the studio waiting for him to show up. One of these people was Janet Jackson. Derek just stopped caring because he was exhausted trying to get Scott Storch clean and would eventually resign from being his manager. In 2008-2009, Scott began to get into legal trouble, and in 2009, he filed for bankruptcy for the first time. For much of the 2010s, legal and personal issues would plague Scott's life. 2014 is when he really tried to get his life back together and climb himself out of the dark hole that he was once in. He had been to rehab multiple times, but it finally looked like he was getting his stuff back together. During the darkest point of his life, there were a lot of people who turned their back on him. Some people may say rightfully so, but I think that this is when Scott realized that this was the music industry and not everybody is genuinely your friend. During his time on top, he had a lot of enablers and bad influences in his circle. There were very few people that were solid around him. Fat Joe was absolutely one of them. He's told stories of Scott Storch only smoking weed back in the day, but when he started to do that blow, he respected Joe so much that he would not do it in front of him. Fat Joe made it a point to stay around Scott as long as he could so he would not do drugs, but he could tell that Scott himself and the other people around him were waiting for the moment that he left to just go crazy. Chris Brown and Mario are two other people who were always there for Scott, and these are two people he frequently worked with after his time on top. I remember around 2017-2018, I started to see a bunch of videos of Scott Storch playing in the studio. In 2018, he produced multiple songs for 6ix9ine, but I had absolutely no clue that he also co-produced Taking a Walk by Trippie Redd.
People don't want me alive, no, they wanna play games with my life, oh.
The only other songs that he has recently done that he has production credits on are Girls in the Hood by Meg Thee Stallion, which peaked at number 28 on the Billboard Hot 100, and Tyler Herro by Jack Harlow, which peaked at number 34 on the Billboard Hot 100. Since Scott's troubles, he's managed to still produce hits. Obviously not on the same level as his prime, but that goes for a lot of producers. I think that we are all glad that he's still out there kicking, and one undeniable thing is that there is no one like him on the keys. The story of Scott Storch is absolutely crazy. If there's anyone that needs their life to be made into a movie, it's him. One thing that he can definitely say about himself is that he's lived one hell of a life already. Those who have been following my channel know that when I talk about an artist, I like to strictly talk about the music. I personally don't like to really talk about drug use or things of that nature, because when I think of Scott Storch, I don't automatically think of that. I think about the hits that he made during his prime. A man who changed the industry, a true hitmaker in his run from 2002 to 2005, 2006 was insane. When it comes to music, he had the Midas touch. It was just hit after hit after hit. At his peak, he was charging 6 figures for a beat. He has so many hit songs, or just even great songs that he's produced, that I cannot fit them all into this video. Go look up all the songs he has production credits on and you'll be amazed. Before I get out of here though, I do want to touch on something that I know some people might comment about. It's a situation between Suge Knight and Scott Storch. Back in the day, they used to live by each other when Scott Storch was still on drugs really bad. Basically, it's alleged that Suge Knight took advantage of Scott Storch in this state that involved Scott Storch allegedly giving up his royalties for pennies on the dollar. Scott addressed this on The Breakfast Club in 2018. He said that Suge never owned anything. But this is what he said though. But all in all, let me know what you thought of the video in the comment section below. What do you think of Scott Storch, and are there any songs that you found out that he produced today that you did not know before? Let me know. I love you guys with all my heart. Peace.